One quick pro tip as far as number formatting is concerned, there's actually an option that I didn't find out about for many, many years that allows you to customize what to do in the case of blank cells. So in this case, let's manipulate our pivot to see some of those blank cells. Now instead of revenue and budget, let's pull budget out so that we're only looking at revenue. And instead of title as a row labels, let's look at the data by country, by genre as columns. So now we have this two-dimensional pivot table where we're looking at data by country in our rows and by genre in our columns. And as you can see, we don't have data for every combination of genre and country. So for instance, we don't have records of any action movies in the Czech Republic. Same with adventure, animation, biography. So if these blank cells bother you and you'd prefer to replace those blank values with something else, there's an option in your pivot table tools that will allow you to do this. All the way on the left, you'll see this options box. Just click on it, and in the layout and format tab, right here in this format section, there's a box that says for empty cells, show. And right now it's blank. You can change that to anything you want. In this case, I think it's safe to assume that if there's no data, then that's the equivalent of driving $0 in revenue. So I'm going to change that to 0 and press OK. And as you can see, now those blank cells populate with zeros. So certainly not critical. Everything will work properly whether I replace those blank values or not, but it's helpful to know that that option does exist. Next up, I want to talk about table layouts and styles. This is a really important lecture because there are a few reasons why you very well may want to use different types of table layouts. And in fact, the default options that Excel provides, in my opinion, really aren't the most useful formats at all. So let's take a walk through and I'll show you what some of these options are. So again, within pivot table tools, you've got analyze options and design options. For this lecture, let's focus on the design tab. And here you've got your layout choices on the left and all of your style options to the right. Now the style options really speak for themselves. Just like you can format a table, you can also format a pivot table with all of these different stock templates that Excel provides. Personally, I like to keep it simple and just go with one of the light options. If you don't want any formatting at all, you can choose the upper left option. Let's just stick with something kind of like this. And then other style options here, you can turn on or off the shading on your row or column headers, and you can add banding to your rows or columns just to help differentiate those. Personally, I typically don't use banded rows or columns, but totally subjective, up to you. And then that brings us to the layout options here on the left. I want to take some time to really talk about what these options provide. And to do that, I'm going to reorganize this pivot table just a little bit. And I'm going to pull genre out of the column labels and nest it under country as a second set of row labels. And let's also bring in color, black and white, and drag that in as a third element. So by default, as I do this, you can see here in the pivot table that it's essentially nesting those dimensions or categories one under the other, all contained within one column called row labels. And this is what we call a compact table style, and it's the default style that Excel will use as a starting point. And if we go up to the report layout options, you can see that compact form is the first option here on the list. So one thing that I don't like about compact form is that it combines or condenses these fields such that it becomes very difficult or impossible to apply things like filters or sorting options to these individual fields because they're all contained within the same row labels. Which brings me to the second layout style, which is actually the one that I prefer by default, called the outline form. And when I switch the table to outline form, it essentially breaks out that one row label column into 3 individual columns, one for each dimension or field here in my row label box. So now I have a column for country, a column for genre, and a column for black and white. They're still nested in within each other as they should be, but now I have the option to apply things like sorting options, label filters, value filters, etc. And we're going to talk all about how to do sorting and filtering later in the course, but just keep in mind that the outline form is a really nice way to kind of split these fields out so that you can edit them as you wish. And then our third report layout, which we're going to talk about in depth in the next lecture, is called tabular form. And when you click on tabular form, it essentially tries to recreate the look and feel of a table. So what it does is that it actually puts the country, genre, and color black and white label all on the same row to kind of replicate what this data would look like as a raw data set or table. And again, we're going to dive into that and show you a quick example of that in the next lecture. But let's jump back to outline form again and talk about some of these other options. One option is to repeat the item labels, and that just fills in the blanks. Again, as it sounds, it's just repeating the labels in each row. If you want to turn that off, you can just choose this last option here. And then similar option here with blank rows. If you want to just space things out and make it a little bit more readable, you can insert a blank row after each section of data, and then go ahead and remove it if you choose you don't want that. And then finally, we've got our subtotal and grand total options. This is just really determining if you want to show these totals either for your rows or your columns. You can toggle these on or off. Right now, I actually just have one grand total line, which would show up at the very bottom, and I've just turned it off, so there's nothing after row 418. If I turn that on, there you go, it pops back up. And then similarly with subtotals, these are the totals that show up for individual categories or row labels. So if you don't show the subtotals, you'll see all those numbers disappear. Whereas if you do enable subtotals, you can choose to visualize them at the bottom of the group, like so, or at the top of the group, like this. So Australia revenue as a whole, 1.5 billion. Action movies in Australia, 843 million. Black and white action movies drove 9 million, whereas color drove 834 million. So those subtotals do help to kind of show how things are aggregating at different levels of your data. But sometimes you don't want those, so you can toggle those on and off right here. So those are table layouts in a nutshell. Next up, we're going to talk specifically about using tabular form to essentially produce a new source data set using a pivot table. So one pro tip relating to table layouts is using the tabular layout to create new source data. And I'll let you know what I mean by that. So let's say in this case we've got our IMDb movie database. It's a ton of rows of data. It's at the title level with all these different categorical fields and metrics. And let's say using the pivot, we just want to aggregate that data up to a slightly less granular level. So instead of by title, maybe I just want a table of data that shows revenues by country, by genre, and that's the deepest I want it to go. In that case, I can exclude anything from the pivot that I'm not interested in. In this case, let's pull color and black and white back into filters, and now I've got the data that I really care about, revenue by genre, by country. The problem is if I copy this and paste it somewhere else, it's not in a very useful format. So I can't just take this and load it into a SQL table or an Access database. And even if I move it to a new worksheet in Excel, I've still got these blank rows, these totals, these repeating values. So this view is helpful from a data exploration and analysis standpoint, but not necessarily helpful in terms of serving as new source data. So what I can do here is change from the outline mode, which we're currently in, to tabular, and make a couple adjustments to turn this into a nice clean table that we can use elsewhere. So the first thing I'm going to do is repeat all the item labels, and then I'm going to turn off the grand totals and turn off the subtotals. And there you go. This gives me a nice clean tabular format with one line item that shows the country, the genre, and the revenue. This means that there's no overlap, there's no duplicated values, there's no extra blank rows. Now all I need to do is grab this table and move it elsewhere and save that as whatever I need to. A CSV, can load it into a database tool, whatever it might be. But this essentially has allowed me to aggregate my data at a completely different level of granularity and produce a new raw tabular data set that I can use somewhere else. So another pivot table formatting trick that's very, very easy but not always intuitive is the fact that you can change and customize your column headers. So right now, we've got our row labels which are named exactly what the fields are named, country and genre. But for gross revenue, when we pulled it in, it automatically assigned this label sum of gross revenue. And that will show whatever summarization mode you're using. And we'll talk about that more in the calculated value section. But sum of gross revenue isn't a very friendly name. So let's say I want to change that to total revenue instead. All I need to do is select that header label and go up in the formula bar and just type in the new name right there. And it just changes the column header to whatever I choose. The one thing I will point out here is that if I wanted to name this gross revenue, which is the name of the raw data column, I'm going to get this error that says the pivot table field name already exists. So a little workaround here, if I just add a space at the end, Excel will treat that as a totally separate value and allow me to drop that in. So little tip there, sometimes you want to use more friendly or more intuitive names for your columns. That's how you do it. One of the coolest and most useful ways to customize your pivot table formatting is using conditional formats. So conditional formatting rules can be applied to pivot tables just like they can be applied to normal data ranges. And you can access these formatting rules right in the home menu of your screen. And for those of you who aren't familiar with what conditional formatting is, it's essentially a formatting rule that you can apply that's based on the underlying value of the cell. So for instance, you can use text or value-based formats, and maybe you want to highlight values that are greater than a certain number, or highlight text fields that contain certain text strings. That's one option. You can also use data bars, which is a really great way to visualize relative values, like the blue bars shown here. You can use color scales, which is an awesome way to make very easy heat maps. Icon sets, which are like up and down arrows and check marks and things like that. And then if you want to get really advanced, you can dive into actual formula-based formatting rules, which we won't really cover here. If you are interested, you can check out that section in my Advanced Formulas and Functions course, where we dive into that piece. So let's jump back to our pivot table and actually test some of these things out. All right, so back in our IMDb movie database pivot, let's use some conditional formats here in our gross revenue column to really bring this data to life. And to do that, I'm just going to select the entire column of data. I can either drag down or I can use the Control-Shift-Arrow down shortcut. And once I have that whole field selected, in my home menu, I can drill down into the conditional formatting rules. Now I'm going to kind of cruise through this and just really scratch the surface. I do dive into these much deeper in my data visualization course, so if you're excited by this and you want to learn a little bit more, recommend checking that out. But for now, I'll give you kind of just a taste of how these can be used. So starting with highlight cell rules, this is a great way to highlight based on the cell's value itself. If we were looking at a text field here, you'd see these other options available, so text that contains certain strings or duplicate values. In this case, we're looking at a numerical field, so our options are limited to greater than, less than, between, or equal to. Let's format any values greater than a certain number. We can just type that number right here. So I'm going to choose 100 million, and we'll format it with green fill with dark green text. Press OK. Now, any value in that range that I've selected that's over 100 million is highlighted in that green shade. So there you go. I can press Control-Z just to undo that. In fact, let me press Control-Y to put it back, because the other way to remove formats is to go into conditional formatting, manage rules at the bottom. You always have access to this manage rules choice, and when you get in there, it'll list out any formatting rule that's applied to the selected range. So right now it's just the one that we created, so we can go ahead and either edit that if we want to change the format, for instance, or we can delete it and press apply, and now we're back to a clean slate here. So let's test some of the other ones. We've got top and bottom rules, where you can highlight a certain number of items like top 10, top 5, top percentiles, highlight cells that are either above or below the average for the selection. Really useful features here. So let's choose top 10, and instead of 10, I only want to see the top 5 in terms of revenue. And we can press OK, and as we scroll down, we should see 5 selected cells. So there they are. These are the top 5 revenue driving titles. I'll press undo to get a clean slate again. And now we've got some cool visual icons, starting with data bars. And this, again, is a really nice way to show relative volume. You have just different colors and styles here. I'll just choose blue bars. And as you can see, these are all pretty low volume here, so the bars are small. And the reason for that, as we go down, is that the US, as you can see here, is a really, really big player in the movie market. So really the number of ticket sales and therefore the number of dollars produced in revenue really dwarfs all other countries in this data set. So that's why we see very small bars up here for most countries. And one thing that's worth pointing out here is that even though I've applied this rule to the specific range from, I believe, C7 through C131 or 171, even though I've applied it to that specific range, if I were to pull country out, that conditional formatting rule will adapt to this new range. So I don't have to clear that rule and set it again. It will kind of morph as my pivot table changes shape, which is really useful. So why don't we select this range that the rule is applied to now, and go in and we'll manage our rules, and we can select and delete it from here. You can also just choose clear rules from the selected cells. It essentially does the same thing. And let's take a look at a color scale. So again, it gives you some options, but all of these are totally customizable in the Manage Rules section. So we can choose a scale from green to red, where green is high and red is low. We can flip it to red to green. You can use shades of red and blue. Let's just do a standard red to green, and this will give us a sense of which genres across the board are driving more revenue than others. So just from looking at this, you can tell that action drives the most, and that adventure, comedy, and drama are the other high-producing genres. And then let's select this again, and we'll do one more example. I'm going to clear this color scale that we just created. And now let's do some icon sets. So this really, it does the same thing. It just allows you to apply different types of icons, like up and down arrows, stoplight shapes, stars, flags, etc. So let's drop some flags in there, expand the width of the column so that we can see the numbers. And then with all of these icon sets, when you manage the rules, you can select the rule and edit it in order to determine exactly how you're defining a green flag versus a yellow versus a red. So all these rules are completely customizable. So there you have it. That's a very quick run through of how to apply conditional formatting rules to pivot table fields. Okay, while we're on the topic of conditional formatting, there's one pro tip that I just have to share with you guys, and it's using a combination of data bars with an invisible text effect to create a really nice visualization. So first things first, let's go ahead and clear these flags that we had set in the last lecture. And what I want to do here is pull in a second instance of gross revenue. So even though it's already inserted into the pivot, I can just drag that field again and create a second instance of revenue. And the reason I'm going to do this is because I'd like to have one column that continues to just show me the raw values themselves on their own, and a second version of the column to treat purely as my visualization column. So like I showed you in the last lecture, I could just select the values, go into conditional formatting, and add data bars here. That works okay. My problem with this is that I don't like the overlap between the numbers and the visuals themselves. I think it's a little bit messy, it's tough to read, so I really want to get the numbers out of this second instance, especially since I'm going to keep them preserved in the first instance of my gross revenue column. So a lot of people will tell you, okay, yeah, you can select the data and you can do a font size of 1 or something like that, or maybe choose your font white, and that will get you 90% of the way there usually, but you still have some weirdness like this, and it doesn't always do what you expect it to do. So I'm going to undo those changes and show you a better approach, and that's using a custom number format. So I'm going to right click and go into number format, and down here in the custom option I can type a specific custom cell format here. And here's the key. If you type 3 consecutive semicolons and press OK, that tells Excel to make the font invisible. And that's exactly what we're trying to do here. So now we've got the numbers themselves and the associated data bar. So we've got a really nice visualization that tells the story very well. So there you go. Pro tip, using data bars combined with custom cell formats to create a really cool visualization effect.